One of the biggest complaints made by long-time hardcore gamers today is that modern video games have a tendency to be extremely easy or simplistic. Publishers often push developers into cutting or altering content in order to appeal to a wider, more casual audience. What little complexity a game may be left with is often explained to the player through painfully long and patronizing tutorials. Only a small number of developers remain in the industry who consistently develop games the way they want to make them, and resist the constant interference of publishers. One such example of this is From Software, the creators of the sleeper hit Demon's Souls. Released for the PlayStation 3 on February 5, 2009, Demon's Souls was a game that quickly became well known for its brutal but fair difficulty, uniquely crafted dark fantasy world, and innovative multiplayer component. A common misconception is that Demon's Souls is the first of a new series of fantasy role-playing games to be developed by From Software, but in fact, it is a spiritual successor to the long-running series Kingsfield. From Software was formed in 1986 with an initial staff of only 4 people. Originally, the company had its eyes set on business application software, but with the release of the Sony PlayStation in 1994, From Software decided to branch out into game development. They created a game that was unique for the time, a first-person role-playing game focused on exploration. Kingsfield was released in Japan on September 16, 1994. It was a frustrating first excursion into the series. You play the character Jean Alfred Forrester, who must search for his missing father in an underground graveyard. It was limited to 5 floors, each with their own distinct feel. Exploring each floor was a lengthy process, as your character moves incredibly slow, and the turning speed of the camera is painful at best. Many times, enemies who attack you from behind will kill you, since you won't be able to turn around fast enough to face them. Exploration was always rewarded. Much like a Metroidvania game, checking every nook and cranny allowed you to gather upgrades that pushed the adventure along. Finding the feather boots, for example, would allow you to walk over pits in the ground. Kingsfield also featured a basic inventory system, and health replenishment was served by grass. The combat in Kingsfield was very basic. You could swing your weapon and shoot projectile magic. A stamina bar was also present, and while full, your swings would do more damage. You could also level up by grinding enemies for experience. All of these mechanics in one form or another would eventually find themselves being used by Demon's Souls more than a decade later. Kingsfield was heavily criticized at the time for several reasons. The graphics weren't quite up to par with similar titles. The controller mapping was rather awkward, with the triangle button used to attack and the left and right shoulder buttons to strafe, look up, and look down. Kingsfield was also panned for being too difficult. Many felt that the lack of a tutorial or explanation was cheap, and thus very few people managed to complete the game. The original Kingsfield never saw a release outside of Japan. However, there exists a fan patch to translate the game into English. The second game into the series, Kingsfield 2, was released in Japan on July 21, 1995. It also received a North American release on December 31st of the same year, but was simply titled Kingsfield for that release. Kingsfield 2 follows Prince Alexander on the island of Melinat. Your goal is to retrieve the Moonlight Sword and return it to King Alfred of the Kingdom of Verdite. The story was limited and focused on being presented to the player through the atmosphere of the world. Many aspects were improved upon from the previous game, with the graphics being the most noticeable improvement. The turning speed and movement were also retuned, allowing you to have much better control over your actions. The world was expanded out of the underground floor system, and you were given a massive map to explore at your own leisure. The changes that were made resulted in somewhat of a split reaction between critics and players. Some felt the game was too difficult and slow, while others found the experience to be extremely atmospheric and rewarding. From Software was fast to release another sequel. Kingsfield 3 was released on June 21, 1996 in Japan, and titled Kingsfield 2 in North America for its October 31st release that same year. The sequel didn't do much to change the formula of the series. In Kingsfield 3, you took the role of Prince Lyle Austin Forrester, son of the king in Kingsfield 2. You must discover why your father has gone mad and save the Kingdom of Verdite. The graphics had improved once again, and higher frame rates improved the playability. Much of the game took place above ground, expanding the world and giving the game a more open feel. At the turn of the millennium, the life cycle of the PlayStation was nearing its end. From Software developed the final home console entry into the series, Kingsfield 4, for the PlayStation 2 and was released in Japan on October 4, 2001. The game was released in North America as Kingsfield: The Ancient City on March 25, 2002. The release was a bit unremarkable. Much like the older games, many people were put off by the slow pace of the gameplay and the extreme difficulty. The graphics were considered to be lackluster compared to other PlayStation 2 titles. The story and world from the previous titles were scrapped in favor of a simpler one. You had to return an idol to an ancient city to lay evil to rest. The final entries into the series were two titles released on the PSP exclusively in Japan, and were titled Kingsfield Additional 1 and Kingsfield Additional 2. These games were extremely simplified, with the most noticeable change being a removal of real-time combat and movement being a very restrictive crawl through dungeons. With From Software being best known for their Armored Core series, no one really expected them to create a role-playing game as groundbreaking as Demon's Souls. This included Sony, the game's publisher, who felt it would not sell outside of Asian territories and decided not to publish it globally. One would expect this to be a kiss of death for any game, but Demon's Souls had one key factor that pushed it into becoming a sleeper hit. The Chinese version of the game had all of its text written in full English. Combine that with the game's voice acting already being 100% English, and you had a game that could be imported to the West and enjoyed to the fullest extent. This caught the eye of the publisher Atlus, who later announced a North American localization of Demon's Souls. Disappointingly, Atlus also lacked confidence in the release of Demon's Souls and believed they would only sell around 75,000 copies. Within 5 months of release, however, the North American release of Demon's Souls sold 280,000 copies. As time passed and sales increased, it became their most successful title and pushed the company into decent profits. Namco Bandai later announced their plans to localize the game for a European release. At its core, Demon's Souls shares many of the same mechanics as its predecessor, Kingsfield, including brutal difficulty. The main reason for its success compared to its predecessor is the addition of key features to the game that dramatically alter and improve the experience. The biggest addition of them all is the online multiplayer, which is perfectly interwoven into the single player. Between leaving behind messages, bloodstains that replay your death, soul signs to summon assistance or duels, ghostly player apparitions, invaders who come for your body and souls, and even a boss being controlled by a real player, there is no shortage of interactivity in this otherwise single-player RPG. Aside from this, Demon's Souls also made great strides in improving the combat, graphics, and world lore through atmosphere and NPC interaction. With the success of Demon's Souls, a sequel was in high demand. However, due to previous disagreements with Sony, From Software decided to seek out an alternative publisher for a worldwide release of their next game. They were already in talks with Namco Bandai at the time for a European release of Demon's Souls, and so made a deal for Namco Bandai to also publish a sequel. This created a problem, however, as Sony did in fact own the rights to the name Demon's Souls. From Software opted for making the next game yet another spiritual successor instead of a direct sequel. This game was Dark Souls, and was initially released in Japan on September 22, 2011 for the PlayStation 3, and later released in North America on October 4th for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Dark Souls retained a large number of features from its predecessor, including the innovative multiplayer component, but also improved upon the combat and gameplay structure. It adopted a far more open world to experience, instead of the centralized hub world used by Demon's Souls. The game embraced its long heritage of difficult gameplay by putting it right in your face with the slogan, "Prepare to die." From Software is a developer that is not afraid to make the game that they want to make, which is incredibly brave in this modern market full of easy and simplified games pushed for by publishers who desire maximum profit. Their willingness to consistently improve their work while maintaining their creative vision is an attribute that should be embraced by all developers in the market. In an industry that was once dominated by vast amounts of creativity, many publishers have drained the very soul from it. It's up to developers like From Software to bring more souls.